Last week, we spoke to Keir Starmer, who told me he didn't want to be Prime Minister when he was a child, although he certainly does now. The week before, we spoke to the Prime Minister, the youngest person in that job in a very long time. Now, we'll hear from Nicola Sturgeon, Scotland's First Minister, in the latest of our leaders' interviews to get us off to a good start in 2023. We sat down in her official residence in Edinburgh, Bute House, and although, as you'd expect, she wanted to contrast the performance of the government in Edinburgh and Westminster, she is also having to deal with strikes and the problems in the struggling health service too. Here she is.
Yes, education is the foundation of so much of everything that a country then achieves. And Scotland has challenges in education like many other countries, but we are seeing a narrowing of the attainment gap. Crucially, we're now seeing record numbers from our most deprived communities go into higher education, go to university. So lots of work still to do, but lots of progress that has been made.
If it's still your number one priority, though, how have you therefore allowed a situation to develop where families and children at the moment are not able to go to school all the time because of a series of rolling strikes that's causing havoc?
We're not simply digging our heels in and refusing to negotiate, as we often see with the UK government. So we are seeking an agreement with teachers. Of course, COSLA, our local authority organisation, is also part of the tripartite negotiations that we have with the teaching profession. So teachers in Scotland are the best paid on average in the UK. Since 2018, teachers have had more than 20% increase in their salary. And right now, can I finish the point? Right now, they're being offered a pay increase for next year that is equivalent in terms of percentage uplift to that already accepted by janitors and dinner men and ladies in our schools. So we're trying to achieve fairness, but there has been further discussion in recent days. As we speak right now, there is a further meeting of the negotiating body underway, and I hope we can see some further compromise that reaches the kind of agreement that we've been able to reach with other groups of public sector workers.
Would you like to pay teachers more, and do you think you will have to pay teachers more in order to sort this dispute out? Because I hear what you're saying you're trying to be fair, but the fact is at the moment there's significant disruption for families and pupils.
So would I like to pay teachers more? Yes. Would I like to pay probably all public sector workers more? Yes. In Scotland, many public sector workers are paid more than their counterparts elsewhere in the UK. Take the NHS. The offer for this year, on average, is 7.5% in Scotland compared to 4.5% in England and Wales. Teachers, well, I'll come back to teachers. Teachers are already higher paid on average than their counterparts elsewhere in the UK.
But experienced teachers in Scotland would say that they're lagging behind their counterparts in England. It is true the starting salaries are more generous, but that's not necessarily true right across the board. What I'm asking you about, though, is what you're going to do to sort these strikes out. It's not about making comparisons to other parts of the UK.
Well, these comparisons are illustrative, but we are working to resolve these disputes. So we managed to resolve the dispute in ScotRail, so that the strikes that happened here were not to do with a dispute with the Scottish Government or with ScotRail. We have avoided industrial action in the National Health Service, and we're working to stop industrial action with teachers. But also, these are all questions, just as they are for the government in Cardiff, Westminster and here in Edinburgh. It's all a matter of political choice. So if you wanted to pay teachers more to get these strikes resolved, if you wanted to commit to paying nurses more in order that strike action does not take place, you could make political choices to spend less on other things. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, but you do have choices. That point, because I think that is a really fair question. You're right to say it's about choices, and we are making those choices, but we don't have all of the levers, nor does Mark Drakeford in Wales, that the UK government and the Treasury currently have.
Do you think the NHS in Scotland is in crisis?
My job is not to describe it. Yes, I think if you are working in the NHS, I think for some patients who are waiting too long for treatment, that's how it will feel right now. The vast majority of patients in NHS Scotland get excellent care and very timely care, but recently too many patients have not had that. We're starting to see, thankfully, an easing of some of the winter pressure. So we've had an improvement over recent days in accident emergency waiting times, for example. So we are working to support the health service through these pressures.
Your party's been in charge here in Bute House for 16 years. And during that time, the problems of the NHS have got worse. The situation has been exacerbated. So what do you say to people who've looked at what's happening in the health service in Scotland in the last few months and thought, how on earth have we allowed it to get to this situation?
Well, I think in many respects, the standard and quality of healthcare over these years you talk about has improved. We've had a 3-year pandemic that has exacerbated issues, lots of reform and improvement in how we deliver healthcare, changing the way people who call for emergency care will be treated. So there's lots of improvements and changes, but there are significant pressures.
Roughly the same number of people are having to wait 12 hours in A&E now as did in 2016.
Yeah.
Now, as a government, if you look at that, that's not progress, is it? That's dreadful.
No, but Laura, to be fair, and I think any minister, probably in any country across the world sitting here would remind you that there's something quite significant happened between 2016 and today. A global pandemic that has put significant pressure on all parts of our health service.
Before the pandemic, though, First Minister.
Well, but if I take the pre-pandemic period, yes, we had a situation where waiting times were increasing, but in the immediately pre-pandemic period, and I can furnish you with statistics, we were starting to reduce waiting times through a range of initiatives and funding that we were applying to that. I think it is perhaps not entirely fair to compare as if we're comparing with 2016 and today. So if you take 12-hour waits, nobody should have to wait 12 hours in an accident in emergency, and the vast majority of people don't wait anywhere near that.
I'd like to ask you about the Gender Recognition Act. Right now, trans adults in Scotland who want to have help sometimes have to wait for as long as 4 years to get the right kind of treatment. Mm-hmm. Is that acceptable?
No, it's not acceptable. The issue around the process by which a trans person can get a gender recognition certificate has attracted all of the attention on these issues because we've been putting legislation through Parliament, but there are a wider range of issues for trans people, and access to support and treatment for those who want to go through certain processes is another of these areas.
So if it's not acceptable, you're in charge of that as part of the Scottish Health Service. Why have you allowed a situation to develop where people have to wait 4 years?
That will not be unique to Scotland, but it's not acceptable, and I'm responsible for Scotland. So we are taking steps to invest more in these services, to improve these services, to reduce waiting times.
Why do you believe that you are old enough at the age of 16 to make a profound decision about changing your gender when you're not old enough, according to the law, to buy a pint in the pub, to drive a car? The law doesn't treat you fully as an adult in the same way you would when it comes to all sorts of different things. So why
in Scotland,
at 16 are you old enough?
You can take a view as to whether you think what I'm about to say is right or wrong. I accept that.
And I'm not saying it's right or wrong.
But in Scotland right now,
you
can choose to get married and have a child. You can join the army. Additional measures were amended into the legislation so that there is greater advice and support available to what would be a tiny number of people of that age group wanting to go through this process. When I was growing up and probably 16, used to take the view that there should be a single age of consent, and I think over time I think it is right to look at why can't a 16-year-old drink alcohol in a pub. You need to look at the particular circumstances, the physical issues around some of these things.
So
but the point I'm making, and this is, all of these issues in Scotland have been, in detail, and this is legislation that has probably been subject to more scrutiny than any other piece of legislation that the Scottish Parliament has passed in almost 25 years.
Some women's groups feel they were not listened to carefully enough, who do have a concern that a tiny minority of predatory men could take advantage of the way that the rules have been changed to the detriment of biological women who are biologically female at birth. If their worst fears are realised, do you and the politicians who have voted for this potentially bear some responsibility for that?
Look, politicians bear responsibility for any legislation they pass and the consequences of that. So, of course, I don't believe that will be the case. We tried very hard to listen carefully to all views in the 2 consultations that were held on this legislation. Some of the groups that work closest with women that are subject to violence by predatory men, domestic violence, Rape Crisis Scotland, Women's Aid Scotland, Zero Tolerance Scotland. These are groups that work with vulnerable women every single day. Mm-hmm. These organisations support this legislation, so it's important to be clear.
Yes, there are some that do and some that don't.
Well, actually, most of the key women's organisations in Scotland do support this legislation. The fear that women have about predatory men accessing women-only spaces to abuse and attack women is very real. You don't have to show your birth certificate to access women's-only spaces. So the point is, this bill does not give a predatory man any more ability to abuse women than that predatory man already has.
The UK government contends that your legislation does have a big impact on the Equality Act that protects rights across the UK for all sorts of different groups. Are they wrong?
Yes, they're wrong. Can I just add perhaps an introductory point here about this supposed clash? When we first put forward this proposal, the UK government had exactly the same plans. Under Theresa May, the UK government was planning to do exactly the same. So the fact that we've ended up in a policy divergent position is not because the Scottish government has changed its mind on this, it's because the UK government changed its mind.
You say there is no effect on the Equalities Act. The legal opinion on that is divided.
The legal opinion on most things, in my experience, is divided.
So but that's the point. It is divided. There are different opinions, so you cannot be categoric that it has no impact on the Equalities Act. Well, and therefore, actually, isn't it the right thing to put the brake on, press pause, while this all gets sorted out?
Well, but the Scottish Parliament considers all of that on every legislation that it passes. And I have not heard any argument about the impact on the Equality Act that I find in any way persuasive or compelling, because the Act does not change the legal effect of a gender recognition certificate. What the UK government has done is just veto it, an instruction to the presiding officer that the bill can't be sent for royal assent. So if the argument of the UK government was that there's an issue that needs to be decided in court, the route they have chosen to take doesn't actually do that. They are exercising, Secretary of State exercising some kind of Governor-General-like power to block a democratic decision that the Scottish Parliament is taking.
Well, actually, it's one elected government, is it not, taking a decision to block something that another elected government has chosen to do in accordance with the law. I mean, you don't like it, but Section 35 is set out there as something that the UK government can do. Well, I said
earlier on, when we started this, the UK government was also consulting on a similar proposal. 2018, you can go back and look at that. In that consultation, the UK government said the issue of gender recognition is devolved to the Scottish Parliament. Scotland can have a separate system if it so chooses. What has changed about that? They did not raise these concerns with us directly during the process of this bill. They wait till after the Scottish Parliament has passed it, and they exercise not something to take it to court, but a veto. It's outrageous.
So
and
what are you going
principle.
to do? So what are you going to do? Can you confirm that you're going to seek a judicial review?
I've already said we will do everything to stand up for and defend the legislation. The UK government are doing this for two reasons, and frankly, it's got nothing to do with concerns about the Equality Act. Firstly, shamefully, disgracefully, they're trying to stoke a culture war on the back of one of the most vulnerable groups in our society, because they somehow think that plays well with their base ahead of the general election. They would, of course,
dispute that very strongly,
would dispute it, but you can get them on to dispute it. I know that, but they're stoking a culture war. And secondly, this is part of a pattern of undermining and delegitimising, seeking to undermine and delegitimise the Scottish Parliament. So the issues are really important, and I feel very strongly that trans people should not be weaponised.
And this is just one of many controversial issues you've dealt with in your extraordinary time. You know, you've had extraordinary electoral success year after year. Do you still think you're the leader who's going to take Scotland to independence?
I would like to think so. I think Scotland's going to be independent. I would, of course. I mean, nobody would believe me if I said, no, I'd rather it was somebody else. But for me, who the leader is that takes Scotland to independence is less important than that Scotland completes its journey to independence. But do you feel that it will still be you? Yes, I do.
Jacinda Ardern said she doesn't have enough in the tank to continue. How much is in the Nicola Sturgeon's tank?
There's plenty in the tank at the moment. If I ever, I don't mean just on a single day, everybody wakes up some days and thinks they don't have enough in the tank, but if I ever reach the point, which she has clearly reached, where I think overall I just can't give the job everything it deserves, then I hope I have the same courage she's had in saying, OK, this is the point to go. But just for the avoidance of all doubt, I don't feel anywhere near that right now.
Nowhere near?
Nowhere near.
Very interesting. Nicola Sturgeon, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.